The first night in the American camp, several prisoners lay awake staring at the ceiling, not because of noise or fear, but because the bed beneath them felt strangely soft, and one man quietly wondered how anyone could sleep properly while sinking into a mattress that felt nothing like the hard bunks they had known for years. The barracks looked plain from the outside, built from rough wood and painted in faded tones that blended into the dusty landscape. Yet the moment the men were led inside, they noticed details that did not match their expectations, because the air carried a mild scent of soap and clean fabric, and the windows were left open to let in light, instead of being shuttered like the buildings many of them had known during the war. Guards spoke briefly, pointing to bunks and shelves, then left the room with a calmness that felt unfamiliar, allowing the prisoners to look around without being rushed. Each bunk had a mattress that rose slightly under the weight of a hand, along with folded blankets that looked recently washed, and although the materials were simple, the care in their arrangement suggested routine rather than scarcity, which quietly unsettled men who had grown used to shortages. A few prisoners pressed their palms against the bedding as if testing whether the softness was real, while others placed their small belongings on the shelves with slow, cautious movements, still expecting instructions that did not immediately come. The sounds inside the barracks were gentle and spread out, consisting of boots on wooden floors, low whispers in German, and the distant creak of a door somewhere down the corridor, creating an atmosphere that felt controlled but not harsh. One man sat down carefully and adjusted the blanket several times, not out of comfort, but out of habit, because order had long been a way to stay mentally steady when circumstances changed too quickly. As evening approached, a guard returned only to explain the basic routine of meals and lights out, speaking through a translator in a tone that remained neutral and measured. Then he stepped away without adding threats or long warnings, which left several prisoners exchanging quiet glances. The absence of shouting or visible punishment created a strange tension of its own, since many of them had prepared themselves for strict discipline and instead found a system that relied on schedule and structure. When the lights dimmed, the room did not fall into total darkness, because a faint glow from outside lamps filtered through the windows, outlining the shapes of bunks and the silhouettes of men lying awake with their thoughts. Some listened to the distant hum of vehicles beyond the fence, realizing the camp was connected to a larger world that continued moving normally, and that realization brought a mix of relief and uncertainty. A few men turned carefully on their mattresses, still not used to the way the bedding shifted under their weight, and one prisoner quietly admitted to the man beside him that it had been a long time since he had slept on anything that did not feel like a board. The comment was not followed by laughter, only by a thoughtful silence, because comfort during captivity raised questions none of them yet knew how to answer. Outside, the night air cooled the wooden walls, and inside the barracks, the steady breathing of tired men gradually replaced the earlier whispers, though many remained half awake, observing this new environment with the alertness of soldiers who had learned that every change carried meaning. The camp did not feel friendly, yet it did not match the harsh images some had imagined, and that difference alone kept their minds busy long after their bodies wanted rest. By the time the room grew quiet, several prisoners had formed the same private thought, which was that captivity here might follow rules they did not fully understand yet, and that learning those rules would be as important as conserving strength. With that realization settling in, the first night passed slowly, marked not by fear or noise, but by the unfamiliar presence of small comforts that made sleep feel possible and uncertainty feel closer than ever. Morning arrived quietly, announced not by shouting but by the sound of footsteps along the wooden walkway outside, followed by the soft opening of the barracks door as a guard checked the room with a brief glance. The light entering through the windows revealed dust floating in the air and the worn texture of the floorboards, and for a few seconds the men remained still, adjusting to the idea that the day had begun without urgency or alarm. That calm start felt unfamiliar to men who associated mornings with orders barked across cold yards and the pressure to move quickly. They were guided toward a washing area where metal basins stood in a neat row, each filled with fresh water that reflected the pale morning light, and several prisoners hesitated before using them, unsure whether this was a privilege or simply part of the routine. One man rolled up his sleeves slowly and splashed water on his face, reacting to the cool temperature with a quiet breath, then stepped aside so the next person could use the basin. The process unfolded in an orderly silence, shaped more by caution than by discipline. Breakfast followed in a modest hall furnished with long tables and benches, where trays were already arranged with simple portions that looked plain but sufficient, including bread, a spread, and a warm drink that released steam into the air. The men studied the trays before sitting down, observing the quantity and variety as if trying to read meaning into each item, because food had become a measure of treatment and expectation. Some ate immediately, guided by hunger, while others tasted slowly, still uncertain whether this level of provision would remain consistent. The room filled with low conversation in German, not animated but thoughtful, as the prisoners compared impressions and tried to interpret the intentions behind the routine. One older soldier remarked quietly that predictability itself could be a strategy, since it kept people calm and manageable, and the others considered that possibility without arguing. Their experiences had taught them to look for hidden purposes, even in ordinary gestures. After the meal, they were shown an outdoor area enclosed by fencing, where they could walk for a limited time under observation, and the open sky above created a sense of space that contrasted with the idea of confinement. The ground was firm and dry, marked by repeated footsteps, and a few men tilted their heads upward as if measuring the height of the fence against the vastness beyond it. The freedom to move within boundaries felt both relieving and quietly frustrating, because it reminded them of distance rather than removing it. A guard eventually signaled the end of the walk with a simple motion of his hand, and the group returned inside without resistance, guided more by routine than by force. The lack of confrontation reduced tension, yet it also required the prisoners to manage their own reactions, since there was no clear enemy behavior to push against. That subtle psychological shift made the environment feel controlled in a different way. As the afternoon settled in, some men organized their small spaces, folding blankets or arranging personal items with care, turning the bunk area into something slightly familiar. These small acts were less about comfort and more about maintaining identity, because structure helped them remember who they had been before capture. Others simply sat and observed, conserving energy while their thoughts traveled between memory and uncertainty. By the end of the day, the pattern had begun to form in their minds, consisting of regular meals, quiet supervision, and an environment that avoided extremes, and that pattern was difficult to categorize as either harsh or kind. It existed somewhere in between, leaving the men alert and reflective. As evening approached again, they realized that understanding this place would take time, and that each calm detail carried weight in ways that were not immediately visible. By the third day, the rhythm of the camp began to feel more defined, and the men noticed how each hour followed a pattern that rarely changed, creating a sense of predictability that slowly replaced the sharp uncertainty of arrival. A bell in the distance marked certain moments, not loudly but clearly enough to signal transitions between meals, rest, and movement, and the prisoners learned to listen for it as a guide to the day. That quiet structure shaped their thoughts, because routine could steady the mind even when the future remained unclear. Work assignments were introduced gradually, explained through a translator who spoke in a measured tone, describing simple tasks connected to maintenance and cleaning within a camp area. The duties were not forced with visible pressure, yet the expectation of participation was understood, and many prisoners accepted the tasks as a way to pass time and preserve a sense of usefulness. Sweeping floors, carrying supplies, and organizing storage spaces became small anchors in long days that might otherwise feel empty. One group was asked to tidy a storage shed near the edge of the compound, where tools and materials were kept in careful order, and the men approached the task with quiet focus, recognizing familiar objects like brooms and crates that reminded them of civilian life. Handling ordinary items created brief moments where the war felt distant, replaced by the simple logic of work that needed to be done well. These moments did not erase captivity, but they softened its edges. Conversations during work remained calm and often reflective, as the prisoners shared small memories of home, farms, workshops, and towns that felt very far away. No one spoke loudly, because the atmosphere encouraged low voices and steady pacing, and those conversations helped them hold on to personal histories beyond their uniforms and ranks. Identity slowly shifted from soldier to individual, shaped by recollections rather than commands. Guards observed without constant interruption, stepping in only when necessary, and their presence felt supervisory rather than confrontational, which required the prisoners to regulate their own behavior. That dynamic changed the emotional tone of the camp, since tension did not build through conflict but through quiet awareness of boundaries. The men learned where they could stand, how far they could walk, and which areas were off limits, absorbing the rules through observation as much as instruction. During a short rest period, several prisoners sat along a wooden wall warmed by the afternoon sun, feeling the heat through the fabric of their worn jackets, and for a while they simply watched the slow movement of clouds overhead. The open sky remained visible yet unreachable, symbolizing both relief and distance, and that contrast stayed in their minds. Some counted days silently, while others avoided counting at all, believing it would make time feel heavier. Meals continued to arrive at regular hours, reinforcing the sense that the camp functioned on schedule rather than impulse, and the men began to anticipate these moments not only for food but for the reassurance of consistency. Even simple predictability could ease the strain of uncertainty, allowing thoughts to settle instead of constantly searching for danger. That subtle psychological effect was noticeable in the way shoulders relaxed and movements became less guarded. As evening returned once more, the barracks filled with the familiar sounds of men preparing for rest, adjusting blankets, placing cups aside, and speaking a few final words before quiet took over. The third day had not brought dramatic change, yet it had introduced stability, and stability itself carried meaning in captivity. The prisoners sensed that this environment aimed to maintain order through routine, and understanding that reality became part of their adaptation, shaping how they would face the days ahead. By the fourth day, the camp no longer felt entirely foreign, yet it still carried a sense of distance from the world the prisoners remembered, because familiarity and confinement can exist at the same time without canceling each other. The men now moved through the morning routine with fewer pauses, washing, lining up, and returning to their bunks with the quiet coordination that develops when people share the same schedule. No one needed to explain each step anymore, since observation had already taught them what to expect. The bedding that seemed unusually soft on the first night became part of this adjustment, and several prisoners admitted privately that their bodies were beginning to rest more deeply than they had in months. Not because their worries had vanished, but because physical exhaustion finally met a surface that allowed real sleep. Even so, some still woke early out of habit, sitting on the edge of the bunk for a moment before standing, as if confirming that the environment remained the same as the night before. During the day, light entered the barracks in longue balanceur through the windows, shifting slowly across the floorboards and marking time in a quiet, visible way, and a few men followed those patterns with their eyes while thinking about how many days might pass in this place. Time inside the camp felt different from time on the outside, because it was measured less by events and more by repetition, and repetition can make weeks feel both shorter and longer, depending on how one counts them. Some prisoners began small routines of their own, folding blankets carefully each morning or keeping their limited belongings arranged in the same order. And these habits created a sense of control within boundaries they could not change. Control, even in small forms, helped maintain dignity, since war and capture often stripped away personal choice. These quiet efforts were not visible acts of resistance, but they were ways of preserving identity. The guards remained consistent in their manner, giving instructions when needed and otherwise allowing the routine to carry itself. And this steady approach reduced sudden tension but required constant awareness from the prisoners, because the rules were clear even when they were not loudly enforced. That environment encouraged self-discipline, as everyone understood that calm behavior kept the day predictable. Outside, the weather shifted slightly cooler, and a breeze moved dust along the paths between buildings, reminding the men that seasons continued regardless of their situation. A few paused during movement between areas to notice the change in air, drawing quiet connections to the passage of time beyond the fences. These small observations helped them stay oriented in a world that otherwise felt paused. Conversations in the barracks grew a little more natural, focusing on ordinary topics such as work, family trades, or towns back home. And although no one forgot where they were, speaking about normal life created brief moments where the mind stepped outside the camp. Those moments were not escapes, but they reduced the feeling of isolation. By evening, the fourth day settled into calm silence again, and the men prepared for rest with the same careful motions they had practiced since arrival. The camp had not become comfortable, yet it had become understandable, and understanding reduced some of the strain of uncertainty. In that quiet realization, the prisoners continued adapting, learning that captivity here followed a pattern shaped by order, routine, and the steady passing of days. By the fifth day, the camp routine had settled into something the prisoners could follow without constant hesitation, and that shift did not come from trust, but from observation, because when the same events repeat in the same order, the mind begins to map them, creating a quiet sense of orientation even in confinement. The men now rose, washed, and prepared for the day with movements that felt less uncertain, guided by the rhythm they had already learned. The bunks that once felt unfamiliar now served a simple purpose, which was to give the body enough rest to face another predictable day. And several prisoners noticed that proper sleep changed how they handled their thoughts, since fatigue often made worry heavier. Rest did not remove concern about the future. It gave them steadier focus, allowing them to think clearly rather than react from exhaustion. Some men quietly adjusted their sleeping spaces, folding blankets in a certain way or placing personal items at the same corner each night. And these small patterns created continuity from one day to the next. Continuity matters in environments where larger decisions are out of reach, because repeating small choices can preserve a sense of personal order. Work, meals, and rest periods continued to follow schedule, and the predictability of those hours reduced the need for constant alertness, which many soldiers had carried for years. The absence of sudden change did not equal freedom. It removed some of the tension that comes from never knowing what happens next, and that difference shaped how the men carried themselves as the days passed. The guards remained steady in their roles, observing, guiding, and maintaining rules without raising their voices, and this consistency reinforced that the camp operated on regulation rather than mood. Prisoners understood that calm behavior kept the system running smoothly, and smooth systems tend to repeat themselves, which made each day resemble the last. At times, a man would pause near a window or outside during movement and look toward the distant landscape, not searching for escape, but simply reminding himself that the world beyond the fence still existed. Those quiet glances connected present routine with a larger reality, helping them keep perspective. Conversations among the prisoners slowly included practical planning, such as how to stay healthy, how to pass time productively, and how to maintain discipline in small matters, because discipline inside confinement supports mental balance. These talks were calm, grounded, and focused on what could be controlled rather than what could not. By the end of the fifth day, the environment no longer felt new, yet it still carried the weight of uncertainty about how long it would last, and that combination of familiarity and unknown duration defined their experience. The prisoners had not accepted captivity, but they had begun to understand its structure, and understanding structure is often the first step in adapting to it. In the end, the soft beds, steady meals, and calm routines did not change the fact that the men were prisoners, and no mattress could remove the distance from home or the uncertainty about when the war would end. Yet those small details shaped how their days felt and how their thoughts settled at night. Expectations formed during years of hardship had prepared them for something harsher, so encountering an organized system built on schedule and maintenance quietly challenged those assumptions. What began as suspicion slowly became practical understanding, because repeated experience showed that the camp followed structure rather than improvisation, and structure, even within limits, gave the men a way to measure time and preserve energy. They learned to read the environment through routine, noticing that predictability often revealed more than words ever could. For many prisoners, the lesson was not about comfort, but about perspective, since ordinary conditions in one place could feel unusual to someone shaped by scarcity elsewhere. Seeing this difference firsthand did not create optimism, yet it added clarity, helping them separate rumor from reality and expectation from observation. Over time, memories of captivity were shaped as much by these daily details as by major events, because people often remember how life felt from one day to the next rather than only the dramatic moments. The sound of boots on wooden floors, the light through the windows, and the simple act of lying down on a bunk became part of that memory. And so this story settles not as a tale of ease or hardship alone, but as an example of how humans adapt to structured environments, learning to navigate routine while carrying uncertainty quietly in their thoughts. Even in confinement, they continued to observe, compare, and adjust, discovering that history is often lived through small, repeated moments that define the texture of each day as the larger events unfold beyond the fence. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.